Don't say it. Don't say it. What are you getting away with?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to History is Lunch on this glorious day. We're in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium of the two Mississippi Museums. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. A few things to know about coming up. This Saturday is the free day at the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. It's every third Saturday, and of course for members, admission is always free. You can pick up membership brochures over by the coffee, cookies, and water. Remember also that the special exhibit For the Record, Music, Storytelling, and Eudora Welty is up at the Eudora Welty House and Garden Education and Visitors Center. It highlights the songs, artists, and albums that inspired Welty or appear in her writing. That free exhibit is open to the public Tuesdays through Fridays, 8:30 to 5 p.m., and Saturdays, 8:30 to noon. And then on Friday, May 3rd, the Welty House will screen the documentary Bill Miner, Eyes on Mississippi. Producer-director Ellen Ann Fentress will be joined by Cleta Ellington, Fred Anklem, and Joanne Pritchard Morris for a discussion before the movie. So I hope we'll see you for that. Finally, I hope that we will see you back here next week for History's Lunch, when our speakers will be John Ramsey Miller and Stephen Smith to talk about McCarty pottery in Marigold, Mississippi. Miller is the author of the book on McCarty pottery, and Smith, the godson of Lee and Pup McCarty, manages the business fairs and restaurant there, so looking forward to that. Today, though, we are delighted to have Suzanne Mars and Seetha Srinivasan to discuss the new expanded edition of Eudora Welty's book, Photographs. Suzanne Mars, and honestly, neither of these people need any introduction to this crowd, but pro forma I will. Suzanne Mars is Professor Emerita of English at Millsaps College. She is the author of Eudora Welty, a biography, and One Writer's Imagination, the fiction of Eudora Welty, editor of What There Is to Say We Have Said, the correspondence of Eudora Welty and William Maxwell, and co-editor with Tom Nolan of Meanwhile There Are Letters, the correspondence of Eudora Welty and Ross MacDonald. Seetha Srinivasan is Director Emerita of the University Press of Mississippi and was in that position when the first edition of Photographs was published. She served as president of the Association of American University Presses in 2003 and 2004. Srinivasan is the former chair of the Women's Foundation of Mississippi and serves on the boards of St. Andrew's School and Mississippi Today. Help me welcome Seetha Srinivasan, who will start this for us.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak about Eudora Welty photographs. And as Chris noted, I will speak about the first edition of this book that was published in 1989. The book has its origins in one of the many conversations that Hunter Cole, who was the marketing director at the University Press, and I used to routinely have about titles to acquire. Hunter is a Welty scholar, and it is his awareness of her accomplished photography that drove our work on this comprehensive collection. As editor-in-chief, I telephoned Eudora Welty. She picked up the phone. "Miss Welty," I asked. "How did you get my number?" was her immediate response. I soldiered on, introduced myself, and asked for an appointment to meet her. When we did meet, she could not have been more welcoming or more receptive to the idea of a book of her photographs. I flew back to the office with the happy news, and we got in gear. I called Tim Seldes, Welty's agent, and Hank Holmes at the Department of Archives and History, which since the 1960s has housed the bulk of Welty's photographs. At the time that we worked on the book, there were about 1,600 negatives cataloged at archives, and Hunter estimates that there may have been an equal number of frames at Welty's house. Hunter and I reviewed the files of contact prints prepared by the archive staff and made an initial selection, including from those that had appeared in One Time, One Place, published in 1971 by Random House, and which was out of print, obviously. And an aside here, One Time, One Place was republished by the University Press in 1996 with a new foreword by William Maxwell. 4 photographs, archives prepared 5x7 prints of our initial choices. I took these to Welty, who reviewed them carefully as we decided what to include in the book. Hunter was familiar with Welty's personal photographs. For the book, she opened up her entire collection, and he worked closely with her to make choices for a total of 226 photographs. Guilford Studio prepared the high-quality prints for use in printing. Award-winning book designer Rich Hendel of Chapel Hill did the layout, following Hunter's suggestion of moving outward from the local and reflecting the pattern of Welty's career. The book returns home with closes out with photographs of close friends and family. Welty remarked that the image that Hendel had chosen for the cover, here, Saturday Off, was one of her favorites. Art director John Langston supervised production of the book, which was printed in Japan. Focusing on accompanying text, we asked Reynolds Price, celebrated author, master teacher, and Welty friend, to write the foreword. My request to Price was that he address Welty's photographs in the context of Welty as writer. And I interject a personal note here. Price's agent was Harriet Wasserman, who sometimes answered her own phone in using different tones of voice. When I identified myself, she would laconically say, "Hi, it's me," a touch from a New York agent that was oddly reassuring to a nervous editor. Price's foreword is titled "The Only News," and in it he eloquently develops his theme of how, as Welty's narratives, and here I quote, invariably work to lift, even to tear, the scrim that hangs between our solitary lives and the needful world. It's useful to see that the line of vision in all her words remains very near to the one held toward us in all these pictures. Some part of the actual world observed by the eye and mind of a single beholder, the just, unblinking, but merciful gaze of a born onlooker. For the book's introduction, Hunter and I conducted a lengthy interview with Welty. Welty's openness and her complete answers resulted in a conversation that covers much and varied ground, some of it not touched on elsewhere. Welty's merciful gaze, Price's phrase, her generosity and grace, her expansive worldview, her curiosity about the human condition, and her sense of humor are all reflected here, as she talks of the art of photography, possible connections between it and writing, the world's photographs show us, her photographs of friends and fellow writers, and of herself being the subject of famous photographers, and so much more. A subject important to Welty recurs, of how her photographs never exploit or exhort. They do not editorialize, were not intended to prove a point, thus making them different from all other portrayals of the South. Her pictures were made in sympathy, and she and her subjects regarded each other with complete unself-consciousness. Welty noted to us that the photographs that she took in the 30s and the 40s could never have been done in 1989 because people had become so media conscious. I wonder what she would say about today's world. Welty's only intent was to allow people to reveal themselves. She noted that her photographs had been exhibited widely and that all who saw them conveyed to her that they regarded the images as expressions of truth and understanding. To quote her, "Human feeling for human beings was a response to what I saw." Welty's dedicated thoughtful and candid responses add immeasurably to the value of the book and make it much more than a definitive collection of her photographs. The introduction is reprinted in the second edition, and I'm selling books here. It's well worth reading. Welty's immersion in the process was gratifying. She read our edited transcription of the interview with attention and recommended changes she deemed necessary. She was keenly interested in the details of the book's production, and with great pleasure we would go to her house for her to review the parts of the book as they came together. As photographs was being printed, we began to publicize it to the marketplace. We knew immediately that the press had a bestseller, with requests for review copies and for excerpts from the book coming from across the country. These were heady days, as Hunter and the marketing staff responded to the New York Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, to just drop a few names. Life magazine wanted to feature a spread, as did Fame and Modern Maturity. I had a crash course in selling rights, learning how to satisfy competing interests with terms like first and second serial rights. I was going to say negotiate, but of course when Rebecca Sinclair, editor of the Times Book Review, called to say that she wanted to run the introduction in its entirety, negotiating is not what I was doing. The introduction was featured on the book review's front page, much to our delight and to the envy of every university press in the nation. Charles Corral devoted a 30-minute segment to photographs on CBS's Sunday Morning, and Roger Mudd interviewed Welty on PBS's McNeil-era NewsHour. Robin McNeil spoke at the book's premiere in November 1989. Popular Photography ranked it among the top 10 photography books of the year. When the paperback was released in 1993, Photographs was a selection of the Quality Paperback Book Club. In all, Photographs was reprinted 5 times for a total of about 30,000 copies. The day after we sent the book to Tokyo to be printed, John Langston came to my house bearing a coconut. He remembered my telling him of a Hindu custom of breaking a coconut to propitiate the gods. And this seemed a good thing to do as we sent Eudora off to the Far East. I recall John's gesture because I think its spirit conveys just how major this book was to the press. Welty's extraordinary trust in the academic publisher of her home state accorded it the honor of publishing the definitive book of her photographs, which lent a significant dimension to the consideration of one of America's greatest writers. It also propelled University Press of Mississippi to a place on the national scene on which it had the good fortune to build. It takes a village to publish a book of this magnitude, but I must acknowledge a few individuals. Hunter Cole, for years of fruitful collaboration and friendship. Tim Seldes, Welty's agent, a generous guide throughout the publication of Photographs and beyond. Forrest Gailey, whose devotion to the Welty collection was evident in her fulfilling with good cheer our multiple requests for prints. Mary Alice Welty White, Elbert Hilliard, Hank Holmes, and Patty Carr Black, who had early drawn attention to Welty's photography with exhibits and catalogs, all for their full support of the project. Our deepest gratitude is, of course, to the photographer herself, whose work is for the ages. Voices far more eloquent than mine have spoken to this, and here is how Reynolds Price ends his foreword. If future minds have not lost all blood kinship with ours, these pictures here will go on bearing clear witness to a time and place much like all others, where life is lived in bolted rooms called men, women, children, to which the only pass key is impassioned care, the calm assurance that their lone plight is seen in earnest and deeply shared and told to others the only news, which is, of course, the title of his foreword. Robin McNeill muses on what a stranger viewing Eudora Welty's photographs many years from now would deduce from the photographer, and I quote, "A young woman with an independent spirit, but modest, unaffected, and unthreatening in her demeanor, who puts strangers at their ease, makes them unself-conscious, who finds a world of fascination in the people and life around her, yet is herself worldly and well-traveled. And above all, he would conclude, this is a person who looks on life with a loving and compassionate eye and records it with a governing and fierce intelligence." The last word belongs to Eudora Welty, who says quite simply at the end of the interview in Photographs, and I quote, "As in everything, I want the work to exist as the thing that answers every question about its doing." She concludes, "I tried to tell the truth." Thank you.
Thanks. It's wonderful to be back here where I started long ago doing research on Eudora Welty. It's wonderful to be here with Seetha, whom I've worked over the years, and to greet all of you. Eudora Welty was born 110 years ago, April the 13th. 30 years ago, the University Press published a large collection of her photographs. Seetha has told you about those. And today we celebrate the new and expanded edition of that important book. And here is its cover. Implicit in our celebration of this new book is our gratitude to Eudora Welty for her genius, her generosity of spirit, and her insight into the human condition. I want to talk today about Eudora's photographic work, and in particular about the two forewords to these two editions as they explore the nature of that work. Eudora Welty's career as a photographer began modestly. She started taking photographs of her native state in the 1920s, perhaps 1929, and soon decided that they might prove of interest beyond her circle of family and friends. She was right. Shows of her photographs were mounted first in Jackson in 1934, then in Chapel Hill, North Carolina in 1935, and ultimately in New York City in 1936 and 37. None of these shows consisted of images taken for the Works Progress Administration. Welty's 6 months at that office were spent here in Jackson, at their Jackson office, were spent as a junior publicity agent. Taking photographs was an activity she pursued on her own as she traveled the state for the WPA. Publication of these independently created photographs came less easily than did exhibitions. Eudora managed to place one photo in a book of images by many photographers in 1935. She undertook commissions, 2 of them for Life magazine in 1937, but received no credit lines. The Works Progress Administration, even though it had not employed her as a photographer, did include 3 of her images in Mississippi, A Guide to the Magnolia State, 1938. 6 years later, she published 3 photos in Vogue magazine, along with accompanying text under the title Literature and the Lens. In 1935 and again in 1937, she submitted a book of photos to publishers, only to have that book rejected. Ultimately, she paired a collection of photographs with a small collection of stories, hoping the photographs would lead to story publication. They did not. But Eudora's stories soon found their way into book form without the photographs, and she focused her attention on writing, her first and greatest professional love. Still, her friends knew about the photographs and remembered them over the ensuing decades. One of those friends, Charlotte Capers, became director of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. In 1957, Charlotte asked Eudora to donate her papers to the archives. The first donation was a set of manuscripts. Then, in 1964, at Charlotte's behest, Eudora added her photographs to the Welty collection. Let me note that acquiring the Welty collection, which also included correspondence, was but one of Charlotte's legendary accomplishments. She served as a planner and principal executive in the restoration of the Old Capitol Museum, the Governor's Mansion, and the Faulkner House. She rescued the Pocahontas Indian Mound from highway construction crews. She wrote the Capers Papers, and she inspired Eudora to seek again book publication for her photographs. In the acknowledgments for that book, One Time, One Place, published in 1971 and dedicated to Charlotte, Eudora wrote, "I would like to thank particularly my old friend, Miss Charlotte Capers, former director, under whose guidance the department acquired and is now housing all of my photographs. Her long and affectionate interest in them encouraged me to assemble this book." Charlotte's long and affectionate interest inspired similar interest in others. One Time, One Place captured the imagination of reviewers who praised its vision, and the publication led to a lecture, complete with slides, in 1973 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Our own Old Capitol Museum would 4 years later present a one-woman show by Welty. Museum director Patty Black, who I'm happy to see back here, was another of Eudora's close friends who recognized the artistic and documentary power of the photographs. Patty, who would eventually publish the monumental book Art in Mississippi, 1728 to 1980, curated a 1977 exhibition simply called Welty, complete with a catalog. This exhibition with catalog paired Welty photographs with her stories and was followed in 1984 with an exhibition and catalog drawing upon Welty family photographs and Eudora's autobiography, One Writer's Beginnings. Ultimately, Patty would complete a trifecta with Other Places, literally a collection of photographs taken outside Mississippi in New York and New Orleans. After Charlotte retired, MDAH, under the direction of R.A. McLemore, Elbert Hilliard, and Hank Holmes, continued to be a good home for Welty photographs. Forrest Gailey, who joined the MDAH staff during the tenure of Mr. Hilliard, has been a knowledgeable, insightful, well-organized, and meticulous curator of the Welty images. And in 1985 and 86, I also had the privilege of meeting with Eudora to examine all of the photographs, attempting to date them and to identify the locations at which they had been taken. I learned that Welty had used 3 cameras in succession, that the negative size for each was different, and was therefore a key to dating the images. I learned where in Mississippi Welty had taken the photographs, and because I asked her about the relationship between photography and story writing, I learned that she had never consulted the photographs when writing. The image she had seen through her camera's viewfinders were recorded in her memory as well as on film, ready for her when she needed them. Parts of what I discovered would prove useful for literary critics. Some of what I discovered would prove useful if an expanded collection of photographs were to be published. The stage was thus set for an extensive collection of Welty photographs to appear. Photographs, the first edition, first issued in 1989 with Seetha Srinivasan and Hunter Cole as its editors, included an interview with Eudora that Seetha has discussed. That interview provided a wealth of information about her work as a photographer, and the book also included, as Seetha has noted, a fine foreword from Reynolds Price, the distinguished novelist and Welty friend. Today, with the blessing of Mac and Seetha, Mac is Hunter Cole. Eudora always called him Mac. In fact, I meant to tell a story about Mac after. I'll just tell it. This was after Photographs was published, and Mac Hunter Cole wrote the book called The Legs Murder Scandal, which some of you may have read. And I'm also sorry that Eudora was not alive to read that book, because she had told me about the Legs Murder Scandal, and the story I heard from Eudora, and this is why she would have so loved Mac's book. Eudora's story was that a friend of hers was at Whitfield drying out, and the friend played bridge with the murderess in the Legs Murder Scandal, the woman who had killed her mother and dismembered her and concealed body parts. Up the chimney went the legs, I think. In any case, so they were playing, she and the murderess were playing bridge with some other women, and Eudora's friend slammed down her cards and said, "Not another card will be played until you tell us what you did with the rest of your mama." So that's totally extraneous, but it's so good I had to tell it. So today, with the blessing of Hunter Cole and Seetha Srinivasan, we celebrate a new and expanded edition of Photographs. Forrest Gailey and MDAH Director Katie Blunt are to be complimented for the wise counsel and support they have provided to Todd Lape, the University Press's talented and able production and design manager, and to its equally talented and able director, Craig Gill. I want to show you some of that edition includes some new photographs, and I'm going to show you the new ones that were added to the original edition. But let me first mention that this photograph, which is the cover image, I got a chance to see before the cover was set and approved, and I thought, oh, I don't know, maybe that's not the best image, and but I let it go. I suggested some others, and I came to like it better. But then we got to see Natasha Trethewey's introduction for the book, and Natasha Trethewey signaled out this image for its greatness, and I read that, and I thought, okay, I'm wrong. She's right. And Todd Lape, who designed the book, had chosen this image without knowing what Natasha would say about it, so he's got the eye, I don't, and this is the cover image. And here are the 16 images that were added to the book. We called that one Buskers. You may have to help me, Mary Alice and Tom. And this one, Watching a Fire. Is that the title, ma'am? I think this one is Dappled, called Dappled. It's a washwoman in the dappled light. Man selling peanuts. We called this one A Man of the 30s as a complimentary image to Woman of the 30s. These are at Vicksburg, another one. A Potter in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Jugtown, I think, is where that was. Putting up a poster, putting up a billboard. Sideshow image. Oh, I love this one from the Ferris wheel. A friend of mine bought a portfolio of Welty images, and this is in the portfolio, should anyone want to buy that portfolio. And I said, well, would you be willing to sell one of the images from the portfolio? And I said, I'd like this one. She said, I'd sell you any of the others, but not this one. This is the old lunatic asylum, as it was called, on the grounds of what is now the University Hospital. Boys carrying ice for Sunday dinner. I'm going to go back. I think that's oh no, that's not the last one. And then some New York City photos. This one I particularly asked for, and Todd was gracious enough to include it because I use it when I teach, so I was glad to have it in the book, and I'll come back to that one. I want to go back to the cover image because I want to talk a bit about that. All right. So, as you know, the University Press was incredibly wise in requesting that Mississippi native Natasha Trethewey, the former poet laureate of the United States and of the state of Mississippi, write a new introduction for photographs to complement the original one by Reynolds Price. Trethewey did so brilliantly, and I'd like to talk a bit about the two forewords to these two editions. They provide lenses through which we see Welty's photographs, and these metaphoric lenses, whether zoom, wide angle, or standard, provide us with truly Weltyian perspectives on the photographer's intent in taking the photographs and on the relationship between photography and literature. In interviews about her photographs, Welty drew a sharp distinction between her own purpose and the purpose of photographs by Walker Evans, the great photographer of the Depression era. Evans's purpose was to call for social change. He staged his pictures to emphasize the dehumanizing power of poverty during the Great Depression. Welty, on the other hand, sought to document the reality, whatever it might be, of these same times, snapping unposed images of people she encountered and of the landscapes and cityscapes in which they lived. Her images make the need for change evident, but also reveal the resilience, complexity, even mystery of the human beings being photographed. Reynolds Price stresses this by saying that Eudora captured what he had often seen. Reynolds was born in 1933, so he did see the Depression firsthand. What he had often seen, but what many of us had not and might not expect to see in photographs of poverty-stricken people, black and white. He writes, "The camera, in many hands, has a ravenous taste for pain and blood. But what's on show in this book still is the oldest, truest pageant of all, the human will to stand and take, upright if possible, whatever comes." Natasha Trethewey also comments on the documentary evidence Welty's photographs provide for viewers, evidence of poverty and oppression, of dignity and strength. This evidence of a time past proved crucial to Trethewey's understanding of family stories told by her much-loved grandmother, who had been born in Gulfport in 1916. Though in my mind's eye I could imagine the nearly vanished world from my grandmother's stories, Trethewey writes, I had not been there, had not seen the street scenes, the candid expressions and subtle interactions, the intimacies and ordinariness, the details on a dress or apron. My grandmother proudly described floral print clothing sewn from cotton cornmeal sacks. Nor had I realized, amidst the constant barrage of cultural images diminishing or rendering monolithic a people, my people, Southern, black, of a particular time and place, that there was evidence of another way of seeing, a vision rooted in an unvarnished attempt to show reality. Eudora Welty's photographs provided that other way of seeing, the visual, historical evidence, a record, she has said, the life in those times. That record was the lens I needed. For Trethewey, as for Price, that record testifies against a monolithic view of individuals. It includes evidence of life beyond victimization. The cover photo of the new and revised edition does so with particular resonance for Trethewey, and that's this image. This woman, Trethewey tells us, this woman seems on the verge of something, paused in her forward motion, as if to present herself as a woman with places to go. A picture of elegant nonchalance, though the look on her face suggests something else. What? Wariness? Awareness? Of self or otherwise? It's hard to know, but Welty captures the ambiguity, the woman's inner complexity. When I first saw the photograph, I couldn't help but think the woman seemed powerfully in charge, an equal participant in the reality that the photograph captures. In it, I see a manifestation of my young grandmother, the decades younger version of the person I'd come to know. A well-dressed woman who'd made all her own clothes, and then my mother's, with the patterns she bought in downtown Gulfport or New Orleans. What a good choice of Todd, of a photograph there. The inclusive nature of the Welty photos, the generous, accepting impulse behind them, struck both Price and Trethewey. Of course, Price and Trethewey are themselves writers, and for writers, the documentary evidence is the stuff of fiction or poetry, ready for artistic transformation. It provides the images that animate their work, that can be interpreted, made metaphoric, made interior. And both recognize that their fellow writer, Eudora Welty, felt the same way. According to Price, Welty explained that her years of snap shooting in rural and small-town Mississippi were among the forces that brought her to the realization that her prime compulsion was to push beyond the silent voice of the image to the stronger but slower voice of words. For Trethewey, Welty's photographic record of Depression-era Mississippi provided an inspiration for creative, not documentary work, an inspiration for her own poetry. Welty's photographs were for me, Trethewey writes, a resource, a way to see a time and place I'd only encountered in history books and my grandmother's stories. I began writing poems with those images in mind, each one a starting place to anchor visually what I'd heard in the cadences of my grandmother's voice, how she'd say, reaching the end of a story, that's just the way it was. For Trethewey, as for Welty, the visual image captured in a photograph is but a starting point, a spark that fires the imagination and understanding. I had to go on to fiction from photographing, Welty once said. That's the only way you can really part the veil between people, not in images, but in what comes from inside, in both subject and writer. So I thought we might look at some images that appear in stories and see what you think of them. What do they document? And if you know the story, how has she transformed them? How has she used them to serve a different purpose in the story? So let me take just a few minutes. We'll look at just a couple. I'm going to rush through these and get down to. Oops, let's start there. Okay, here's a photo of New York City. Has anyone here read Flowers for Marjorie? The Welty story, Flowers for Marjorie. That's a story, Flowers for Marjorie is a story set in New York City about a couple, Howard and Marjorie, from Mississippi. Howard is unemployed. Marjorie is pregnant. He can't find work. He is desperate. Marjorie is somehow content because she's looking forward to the birth of her child. She loves her husband. She wants him to find work, but she is much more able to cope with the situation than he. This image is not in that story, but Welty, having seen New York City during the Depression, might have been thinking of it, because when you look at this image, what I focus on are those two men with their heads down on the park bench who look almost in despair. And then you look up above them and there's a clock. And in Welty's story, Howard is very conscious that time is going by and he cannot find a job and that his baby is going to be born and he won't be able to support that child or his wife or himself. And then you look back in the background, there's a savings bank. They have no money in a bank. The banks during the Depression having been closed. Up on the top there, you see a sign that says NRA. And the NRA was a program during the Depression, the National Recovery Act, intended to help people who were being devastated in this economy, but in fact, it hurt people rather than helping them. So there's that kind of irony. None of that's in the story. But what is in the story is the mood of those two men, I think. And Welty took that, but she took not this image from outside, but focused upon Howard's despair. So in the story, Howard comes back to his apartment from a scene like this at Union Square. His wife is hopeful. He thinks he's hallucinating. He goes in the kitchen, he gets a butcher knife. He comes out, he plunges it into her. And she slumps over, and he leaves, drops the knife, leaves, and he goes out, visits the WPA office, goes to a bar where there's a slot machine, puts a nickel in, wins, goes to Radio City Music Hall. He's the, I forget how many millionth person to enter. He gets a prize for that. Everything is going well. And he almost has forgotten that what he has done, and he comes back home, and he's a policeman there, and the policeman is going to take him upstairs, and this is going to all come out. The devastation is going to come out. The interior world, the image of this kind of despair, but the fiction writer takes it in a different direction. Beverly, I'm going to call on you. Do you think there's something else we should say about Flowers for Marjorie?
I think it's one of our saddest stories.
One of the saddest stories.
There's not, in almost every other story, even if it's sort of a sad story, there's some humor. I mean, if you're looking for humor, I guess what you would find instead of humor would be irony.
Right. Yeah, there's not much humor here. Let's look at it. This is a happier image. This is down in Crystal Springs at tomato packing time. There's the tomato packers are having a little recess. This is called Tomato Packers Recess. And one of them has a guitar he's playing for the others. So what about this image and what it documents? Does anyone want to comment on this one? Yeah, Lorraine?
Picture for Elvis Presley.
It looks like an early picture of Elvis Presley. Oh, here's young Elvis, poor but singing his heart out. Yeah. This image comes directly into a story. Welty describes tomato packers with one of them playing a guitar in her story, The Whistle. And The Whistle is a story of a tenant farming couple who are also very poor, whose crops every year, it seems, are destroyed by a freeze. They're rail thin. They don't have enough to eat. They are sleeping on a pallet by a fire, and when a whistle sounds for a freeze, they get up, they go outside and cover the tomato plants, which are planted right up to the edge of the house. And finally, the husband takes off his coat and covers plants, and the wife takes off her dress. They've been sleeping in their clothes, and she covers the plants, and they go back in, and it's colder still. They've forgotten and left the door open. And in the spite of this, they burn their last log, and then the husband knocks apart the furniture, and they burn the furniture, the kitchen table, and the whistle is sounding again. So in the middle of this story, before they have to go out in the freeze, Sarah is remembering what it's like in summer. And here's an image from summer. And she's remembering that the Florida packers come and that they pack up the tomatoes and that they have, when they get a chance to rest, they sing. And that there's images of warmth and light and pleasure. in contrast to the cold, the barrenness of their lives in the farming in the face of a natural world that is unforgiving and in the face of a social system, tenant farming system, that is as well. So we have the image, but then that image is valuable in the story for what it tells about Sarah's dream of warmth and hope, and then how much more devastating it is when that hope is blotted out at the end, when the whistle sounds again. Anybody else about the story, the whistle? Chris, maybe I should stop on images, you think, and then we'll take questions more generally. I can show one more. Bottle trees. I have 2 at my house, but they're on metal. They're not on dead crepe myrtles. And behind the bottle trees, I think it's a peach tree in bloom. And then there's a cabin, a home, rutted path up to it. This image also comes directly into a story called Livy, which is a story about a young black woman who has married an elderly black man named Solomon, a man who has, in the midst of everything, managed to own his own land, to retain his dignity, to have a nice house, not this one, with a yard which is swept and swirls, an orderly kind of yard. And he has constructed bottle trees, and the reason he has done that is to ward off evil spirits caught in the bottles. His desire is protection. He has a young wife, he wants to protect her, but she's young and he is old and dying. She's more like that peach tree, flowering. And so Welty takes the bottle trees and the peach tree and puts them into Livy, but they're not serving the purpose. This tells us, okay, people in the country had bottle trees, right? They might plant fruit trees. They may live in horrible, sad conditions, but there is this attempt at beauty out front and at protection and security. But beyond the documentary, Welty uses it for something else in the story. All right, well, let me just finish up by saying that whether Welty's photographs play a documentary role for us or whether they help us to see how the real world functions emblematically in a story, they reveal one important truth about Eudora Welty, one she expresses in the foreword to One Time, One Place, a third foreword, this one hers. There she acknowledges that though 2 art forms contended for her time, they had a single impetus. In the act of taking pictures, she discovered that my wish, indeed my continuing passion, would be not to point the finger in judgment, but to part a curtain, that invisible shadow that falls between people, the veil of indifference to each other's presence, each other's wonder, each other's human plight. But in the moment of that discovery, she also realized that a fuller awareness of what I needed to find out about people and their lives had to be thought through writing stories. Today, 110 years after Welty's birth, we can rejoice both that she did write such complex and compelling stories, and that these stories proceeded from the same passion that led her to take such powerful photographs. Thank you. I believe that Chris intends for us to take questions. Is that right?
If you'll have them.
Seetha, you want to come up here?
Eudora Welty's photos remind me of James Vandersea from Harlem and Gordon Parks. Mm-hmm. Eudora spent some time in New York. So did she ever comment in her memoirs what she thought about other professional photographers?
I don't remember a comment about Gordon Parks, which I think would have been possible. The only photographer I remember her commenting about specifically is Walker Evans. Do you? No, she did like she thought about studying with,
Was it Louise Dahl Wolf?
not with Louise Dahl Wolf, somebody help me out here, in New York.
Irving Penn? Not Irving Penn.
No, a woman.
Julia Cameron? No.
Not, she didn't like Lang's photographs particularly. No, Dorothea Lang, she was not crazy about those. It'll come back to me. This is the virtue of being 72 years old. It sometimes takes me a little while, but usually I get it. But so she did admire her. She taught at the New School for Social Research. She applied to be in the class. She wasn't accepted. And she, but I haven't seen a lot of comments. Patty, do you remember any about? Forrest might know. Comments about other photographers? Yeah, Bernice Abbott. Bernice Abbott's the person I was trying to think of, that she admired and tried to get into her class. Thank you.
She does in the interviews, however, talk about being photographed by some really famous photographers like Cecil Beaton, Irving Penn, Louise Dahl Wolf, Jill Cremens. The list goes on, and she says that one thing she did learn from these being photographed was that these people never said, sit like this, do this, and they never said, smile, please. So that was kind of an interesting little sidelight we got about her own reaction to being photographed.
My question is kind of personal. From your name, Seetha, and your dress, where you're dressed, and you mentioned something about Hindu. I am assuming that you are Indian background, from India. And I'm just wondering, from that kind of a different cultural background, what it is that caused you to want to write or become interested in an American author like Eudora Welty. I was just wondering if was it cause you to want to do something of a different cultural background?
That's completely from left field. I think that I don't have any special expertise in Eudora Welty or Southern culture, but I think what draws me to the work that I did, which is publishing, is because it gave me the opportunity to connect with different cultures, and also the opportunity to show what it is we all share and have in common. And I think that's what came to me as I continued my work, because yes, I dress in a sari, which is my native to India, but once I got talking with authors about their work, none of those things seemed to matter. What mattered was that I could connect with them about their ideas, their critical thinking, their interest in culture and publishing a work. So there's a lot of commonality that comes up, and the differences go away. And I never thought of them as differences. This is how I dress.
Just the way it was.
I know, that's just the way it was, and the way it is.
In the wonderful interview that Seetha and Hunter did with Eudora, she says that when she was photographing people from cultures very different from her own, she was thinking that she was imagining herself into their lives. And one time in another place she said, I never doubted that fiction is all about imagining yourself into lives not your own. And so it's a way of breaking down barriers, of getting rid of that scrim that Reynolds was talking about. Yeah. So the editor had the same approach as the photographer.
Well, thank you.
That's good.
You've been very generous to acknowledge the contributions of the Department of Archives and History. I wanted to make sure that one additional person was mentioned, and that's Judy Hocking. She's the reformatting technician who scanned the negatives.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Okay.
And if you've seen the first edition, the photographs are beautiful. I encourage you to look at and buy this edition because you'll see greater detail in many of the photographs.
Her name, of course, Judy Hawking.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Okay, there she is. Right
There
Thank
she
you.
is, right over there.
Other questions?
Thank you. Whoa. Thank you for the program today. Yeah, my question, I have a two-part question. I'm wondering if Welty had any kind of personal connection to the downtrodden that attracted her to this group of people that she wanted to photograph so often. And I'm also curious how some of her photographs ended up in the collection at the Mississippi Museum of Art.
Well, I think she had an interest in people generally. And if you're living in Mississippi during the 1930s, poverty is a pretty general state of being. So she encountered it. She encountered these people. I don't think she really thought of them necessarily as downtrodden. She thought of them as her fellow human beings who were facing life in very straitened and difficult circumstances with a lot of courage, and who found joy, who put on a bird pageant and because they at a Ferry Street Baptist Church because they needed a new piano, and so they created costumes and had the bird pageant, and Eudora saw them and photographed that pageant, who were walking down the streets of Jackson, Mississippi, and she might ask to take pictures or go into a small town where people had never had their pictures made at all, and she was able then to send them that photograph, which was something very special to them. So I think that she was a person who was really open, accepting, interested. She said about the writer Elizabeth Bowen that Elizabeth Bowen was a great intaker, and I think Eudora Welty was a great intaker, or as Reynolds Price says, onlooker. And there was that generosity of spirit and that empathy that characterized her encounters with people of all classes and walks of life.
She says that in both her writing and in her photography, they both come from the same kindred impulse, and that is she was responding to what she saw. And of course, her gaze was so generous and gracious, so what we get then are these images of people, yes, who may be downtrodden in a traditional sense, but what we get are the images of joy and their resilience. And of course, we come back to a woman of the 30s, which is a famous image where she talks about strength.
Not to belittle the straitened circumstances;
Right,
those were
never.
very real and something that she thought was unjust. But to see that people could face this with considerable resilience.
And she never denied the straitened circumstances
Right.
either. That's what it was.
There was
We
a kind
come
of
back to that.
ferocity there.
Yes.
That, yeah.
Did she have a dark room and do her own processing?
She did in her kitchen.
Yeah, she
Suzanne
did. I
can
think it was
speak
a
to
kind
that,
of
yes.
a slapdash sort of dark room, but she
Right.
did it in the kitchen. She had her negatives developed by Standard Photo
And then she-
on Capitol Street, and then she would print them in the kitchen. She
Kitchen
had an
on
enlarger.
1119 Pinehurst Street, and she talks about hanging those prints out to dry. Yes, she did do her own
Yeah.
printing.
And when she went to New York and went to the Lugene, the camera shop that ran the Lugene galleries, she got some advice there about how she might make better pictures and what supplies, what different supplies she might use and so forth. But she was teaching herself. Her father knew about cameras, and she had learned from him.
We've talked about her sense of humor. Oh, maybe there's another question, so I should stop. And
Well, we had this issue discussed here a few presentations ago about when you photograph someone, do you always get their permission first? And was that like,
I think typically she got
Typically she
permission.
did,
I
and
mean,
she-
I'm sure there were instances where she just snaps something, but typically she would ask permission and she would say, just go on about what you're doing, and I'd like to take some photographs if that's all right. So she tried not to intrude.
But she would say, may I take your photograph? And people were very receptive to her. She's very particular to point that out. She also says, and I think this is a wonderful comment, we asked at some point in the interview, well, what about some of the anonymous people in your images? And she said, there are no anonymous people in my photographs, which I thought was so Welty-esque.
Yeah.
I have a funny story from the interviews, if we have a moment. John Woodburn, and I know Suzanne knows this story, her editor in New York, was working with Henry Miller, and Henry Miller was working on a book called The Air-Conditioned Nightmare, and he was supposed to be in a glass-topped automobile, and he was going to go across the country and record narrative and images and take them back, and it was all going to be printed in this book called The Air-Conditioned Nightmare. Well, when Woodburn thought, oh, what fun to send Henry Miller to Jackson, Mississippi, and of course he called Eudora, and Eudora's mother said, no way, he's not coming into our house.
He had written to her and said,
Right.
I can help you out. I can put you in touch with the pornographic publisher. You write for him, you'll make some good money. And when Mrs. Welty heard that, she said,
No way.
no way.
And so Miller comes to Jackson, and of course Eudora has, I think, Hubert Creekmore and Nash Berger to go and show him
Like
around.
ramen.
And she said they go to a restaurant called the Rotisserie, which apparently had a takeout part, a steak part, and a dance part. And so she would go on different nights to different parts of the restaurant, and Henry Miller at the end said, gosh, I didn't know you had 3 such fine restaurants in Jackson, Mississippi.
Eudora
at
told
the
me
end
he
of it all,
was the
Jackson
most boring man she ever
That's
met.
right. That's right. But she had a good story for John Woodburn.
Yeah.
Well, we have come to the top of another hour. It was a great presentation. We do have copies of the book for sale over here, as well as some numbered posters of one of Welty's more famous shots of Windsor that were produced for the centennial. They're deeply discounted. I think they are $5 a piece. So,
Wasn't that taken on, I think it was, the trip she went to Windsor with Henry Miller, was it not? I think it was. But you can see Eudora's image in the...
That's right. And this is just a footnote. When we wanted to reproduce that photograph in the first edition, she wanted us to crop her shadow out of the picture, and we said no, and she said, okay.
And in Natasha Trethewey's introduction to the new book, she talks about that very image and how important it was that shadow was in the image.
And Robin McNeil does as well when he talked at the premiere of the book's publication.
All right, we really will shut up now.
thank you all for coming. Help me thank Seetha and Suzanne for this. Hope we see you next week.